We're studying about the Jewish people tonight. The last class I did was on slavery. We realized that there were sometimes to 20, 30, 40, 50, even 400 to 1, 400 slaves in the Roman Empire to one free person. Most generally it was 3 to 1, 4 to 1, something like that. Now the Jewish people were free in their land. Herod the Great had set up the high priest. The high priest, Caiaphas, was not a believer. He was a non-believer. He was a Sadducee. He did not believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in basically God. He was basically a deist. He didn't believe in angels, didn't believe in spirits or anything. This was the guy that was high priest over Israel when Jesus was there. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees were working together to condemn Jesus. Now, in the Roman Empire, you were pretty much free and safe to travel from one end of it to the other. There were some malefactors on the way, like we have the story of the Good Samaritan, but that was kind of an unusual thing. There were robbers and things, but the Roman Empire kept it down. They crucified people. That's a great deterrent to crime. You know, in the Bible it teaches that if somebody kills somebody, they need to be executed. Simple as that. That's a deterrent to crime. Now Jesus said to Jerusalem as he stood up there on Mount of Olives, looking over, he said, O Jerusalem, woe unto you, Jerusalem. For I would have gathered together like a mother hen would be your baby chicks, but you wouldn't come. Now there was a group of people there that called the Sicarii. And Phillips Schaff, in his Christian history here, tells about them. Felix calls these Sicarii assassins. It comes from the word Sika. They were armed with daggers and purchasable for any crime. By the way, they were a slender, very sharp dagger. They would the term cloak and dagger came from the Sicarii because they wore their long coats, and underneath their coats would be a dagger. They would slip into a feast or some type of a ceremony, and they would go up to any Roman soldier, the higher rank the better, and would slip that knife, that Sicarii, Sika, into between their rib cage in the front and up into their heart, twist it and come out and walk off and live and bleed out. And put it back underneath the cloak and dagger. Now the Sicarii were causing a lot of trouble in Jesus' time. They were they believed that God was going to give them back the land, but now you realize the Sicarii were not the friends of the Jewish people either. They were a sect, just like the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and the Sicarii. Sicarii would go into villages and actually kidnap people. They would rape women. They would do whatever they call their food. And they would do this because they said the Messiah is coming and God is going to bring his kingdom back. And they were looking for a false Messiah because the Messiah that Jesus, the Messiah Jesus, did not come as a warrior yet. Now, the Sicarii that escaped Masada was basically a Masada fortress, or a Sicarii fortress. When Pontius Pilate tried Jesus, he denounced him or pronounced him 5 times innocent. And he told them, you are bringing this innocent man's blood upon me, and I washed my hands of it. He washed his hands with a bowl of water, and they said, let his blood be upon us and our children, and basically it was. They did not want Jesus. Jesus was born in the right place. He was born at the right time. He was born from the right family. And he was born of a virgin, like Genesis 3:15 said, and other places in the Bible. They didn't want Jesus. They wanted to kill him. Pontius Pilate knew that they were going to kill him, wanted to kill him, and he told Jesus one time that he said, I will try to protect with all of my power. I will try not let any harm come to you. Don't worry about it. I will not but back off on these people because they are vicious people. Back off on your denunciation of them because they're going to try to kill you. And they'll try to use me to do it. And I don't want to be a part of it. Well, in the meanwhile, when Jesus was actually going to be tried, the night before he tried, his wife, Pontius Pilate's wife, which is Tiberius Caesar's daughter, told him, do not have anything to do with this righteous man. I'm having bad dreams about him. God was visiting her in dreams. God does that. There's a set of messages I have, dreams and visions and hypnosis in the Bible. Now, Pontius Pilate denounced them, said that they were guilty instead of Jesus. They should have been crucified, not Jesus. But they were absolutely just at the point of a total rebellion. So he had to do what they wanted to do. And he wrote a letter to his father-in-law, Tiberius Caesar. In that he told that he had interviewed Jesus before, that he was a righteous man, that he was more than a prophet, that he should actually be looked upon as a god in the Roman Empire. That he had suggested that they decorate him as a god. The Senate wouldn't do it. But these are the words. This is recorded all over history at that time. All contemporary history tells about Pontius Pilate's letter to Tiberius Caesar. Now, the very person that they called for, they said, would you like to have Barabbas or Caesar? And they said, give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was one of these Sicarii that had gone and raped and pillaged. And they wanted him, and here, you want me to turn him back loose on you? Or do you want me to give you Jesus? I'm going to set somebody free. Give us Barabbas. Well, Barabbas caused the Roman Empire to come in and totally destroy the nation. That's what we're going to talk about. They had such an idea that they wanted a Messiah that was going to be the king right then. Well, that's not the way God worked. But they wanted it their way. Remember, they wanted a king one time and he gave them Saul. And then he gave them the king that he wanted them to have, David. After the dynasty of Phillips, assassins called Sicarii, comes from sickness dagger, armed with daggers purchasable for any crime, endangered safety in the city and the country, and roamed all over Palestine, ripping, killing, murdering, and robbing the Jewish citizens also. Besides this, the party spirit among the Jews themselves and their hatred of their heathen oppressors rose continually, inflamed by the false prophets and messiahs, and one of whom, for example, according to Josephus, drew after him 30,000 men. This is what's going to be their downfall. They believed that the Messiah was coming, their Messiah, not God's Messiah. And they were stubborn about it. They would kill God's Messiah, and they knew who he was. Thus came to pass that our Lord had predicted, there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall lead many astray. At last, in the month of May in AD 66, under the last procurator, Gessius Florus, from 65 onward, a wicked and cruel tyrant who, as Josephus says, was placed as a hangman over evildoers. An original organized rebellion broke out against the Romans, but at the same time a terrible civil war also between the different parties and revolters themselves, especially the zealots. Now, zealots there are the Sicarii. Two Sicarii were in Jesus' church. Simon the Sicarii, or zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Judas, man from Cariot, is what it means. And he was a Sicarii. Simon, he was converted. Judas was not. He continued to be an assassin and sold Jesus out. The zealots and the moderates and the radicals and the conservatives. The ferocious party of the zealots had all the fire and energy which religious, patriotic fanaticism could inspire. They have been justly compared to the Montagnards and the French Revolution. They gained the ascendancy in the progress of the war, took forcibly possession of the city and the temple, and induced a reign of terror. These are the Sicarii. And they took over Masada, the impregnable fortress. They kept up the messianic expectations of the people, hailed every step of the way towards destruction, a step towards deliverance. Every time they took a step towards destruction, actually they thought they were going to be delivered by their false messiahs. Reports of comets and meteors and all sorts of fearful omens, prodigies, were interpreted as signs of the coming Messiah and his reign, and yet the Messiah had come and they killed him. And they were killing the children of God, the Christians. The Messiah and his reign over the heathen. The Romans recognized the Messiah in Vespasian and Titus. To defy Rome at that age without a single ally was to defy the world in arms. They were nuts, stupid, ignorant people. They could not conquer the Roman Empire, yet they kept clinging to this false Messiah. Jesus said, don't follow them. They'll lead you away from me and away from God, and they'll get you killed. They read the book of Maccabees and were blinded against their inevitable failure and this mad desperation of a revolt. Nero, informed of the rebellion and his most famous general Vespasian, with a large force he sent to Palestine. Nero killed himself, and the emperors Galba, Otho, and Vitellius followed one after another in rapid succession. The latter was taken out of a dog's kennel in Rome while drunk, dragged through the streets and shamefully put to death. Vespasian, in the year 69, was universally proclaimed the emperor and restored order and prosperity. I mean, it went into chaos, kind of like America is today. Chaos. That's a planned chaos. His son Titus, who himself 10 years after became emperor and highly distinguished himself by his mildness and philanthropy, then undertook the prosecution of the Jewish war and became the instrument in the hand of God of destroying that holy city and the temple and many of his rebellious people. Yet they were following tenaciously, believing in the false messiahs. Jesus said, don't follow them. Paul said, don't follow them. John said, don't follow them. But they did. He had an army of not less than 80,000 trained soldiers and planted his camp on Mount Scopus and adjoining the Mount Olivet, in full view of the city and the temple, and from this height, from the best advantage, the valley of Kidron divided the besiegers from the besieged. In April AD 70, immediately after the Passover, when Jerusalem was filled with strangers, Jerusalem was filled now with believers, Jews from all over the world and proselytes. The siege began. The Sicarii rejected with sneering defiance and repeated proposal of Titus. Titus tried to get them to surrender and knock it off, people. We can live together. No way. Stupid. But this is all according to God's eternal purpose, because he knew it, they'd do it. The prayers of Josephus, who accompanied him as interpreter and mediator, and they struck down everyone who spoke of surrender. They killed him. They made sorties down the valley of Kidron, up the mountain, and inflicted great loss on the Romans. They were assassins, murderers. As the difficulties multiplied, their courage increased. No matter how many of them died, no matter how they were outnumbered, they read Gideon, they read the Old Testament, but they were against the plans of God. They had killed the Messiah King of Israel. They wanted their way, not God's way. The crucifixion of hundreds of prisoners, as many as 500 a day. 500 crucified a day. Only enraged them even more. Even the famine which began to rage and sweep away thousands daily and forced a woman to roast her own child and eat it, as history tells us. The babes, the most pitiful scenes of misery around them could not move them away from their crazy fanatical ideas. History records no other instance of such obstinance and resistance, such desperate bravery and contempt of death. The Jews fought not only for civil liberty and life and their native land, and they had it. They had life, they had their temple, they had a false king, they had an unbelieving high priest, but they had their way. But for that which constitutes their national pride and glory and gave their whole history its significance, or the religion, which even in the state of horrible degeneracy, infused into them a most superhuman power of endurance. Demonic power of endurance. The destruction of the city and the temple. At last, in July, the castle of Antonia was surprised and taken by night. By the way, that's the only place left there. They prepared the way for the destruction of the temple, in which the tragedy culminated. The daily sacrifices ceased on July the 17th because the hands were all needed for defense. The last and the bloodiest sacrifices at the altar of the burnt offerings was the slaughter of thousands of Jews who had crowded around it, grabbing and holding onto the altar for God to save them. But they were out of God's will. Titus, according to Josephus, intended to save that temple, that magnificent work in architecture, as a trophy, as a victory. And perhaps for some superstitious fear, and when the flames threatened to reach the Holy of Holies, he forced his way through the flame and smoke over the dead and dying to arrest the fire. The Jews were holding on. They went into the holy place and the Holy of Holies, wanting God to save them. Well, the only one salvation there was in Israel was Jesus Christ. And they rejected that. The destruction was determined by a higher decree, Josephus said. His own soldiers, roused to madness by the stubborn resistance and greedy of the golden treasures, could not be restrained from the destruction. By the way, the real Ark of the Covenant was not there. The real Ark of the Covenant was already hid over there on Mount Pisgah, where Moses looked into the Promised Land in a cave there by Jeremiah. This, what was put in the temple, was not the original Ark of the Covenant. The halls at first around the temple were set on fire. There were halls around it. It was surrounded. Then a firebrand was hurled through the Golden Gate. When the flames arose, the Jews raised a hideous yell and tried to put out the fire, while others, clinging with a last convulsion grasp to their messianic hopes, false messianic hopes, rested in the declaration of the false prophet that God, in the midst of the conflagration of the temple, would give a signal for the deliverance of his people, that angels were going to come to heaven. Well, the angels already told them that Jesus had come. They rejected that. the legions vied with each other in feeding the flames, and made the unhappy people feel the full force of their unchanged rage. They were mad at these people. They gave them every chance in the world to live with among them in peace, but that wasn't going to happen. Soon the whole prodigious structure was in blaze and illuminated the skies. It was burned on the 10th of August, AD 70, the same day, the year on which, according to tradition, the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. No one, says Josephus, can conceive a louder, more terrible shriek than that rose from the sides during the burning of the temple. These people screamed and hollered until they screamed and hollered their last breath. They wore themselves out screaming to God to save them, but they had killed the Son of God. The shout of victory and jubilee of the legions sounded through the wailings of the people, now surrounded but with fire and with sword, and upon the mountain and throughout the city, the echo from all the mountains around, even to Perea, increased the deafening roar. Remember what happened when they cried Jesus, and Pontius Pilate said, "Do you want Barabbas or Jesus?" They said, "Jesus," and their feet stamped on the stone until the whole praetorium vibrated. Like the hounds of hell, he said, were coming. This is what they're doing now, except they're dying. Yet the misery itself was more terrible than all of this order. The hill on which the temple stood was seething hot, seemed enveloped with a base in one sheet of flame. The blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those who were slain in number than those who slew them. The ground was nowhere visible, except for fallen people and blood. All was covered with corpses. Over these heaps the soldiers pursued the fugitives, because they wouldn't surrender. They still believed a false hope. The Romans planted their eagles on the shapeless ruins over against the eastern gate, offered their sacrifices to them, and proclaimed Titus Imperator. And the greatest acclamations of joy. Thus was fulfilled the prophecy concerning the abomination of the desolation standing in the holy place. You see here, this writer thinks that the book of Revelation is history, not prophecy. Jerusalem was razed to the ground. Only 3 towers of the palace of Herod, Hippocrates standing, Baasel, Margamain, together with the portions of the western wall, were left as monuments of the strength of the conquered city, once the center of Jewish theocracy and the cradle of the Christian church. Even the heathen Titus is reported to have publicly declared that God had a special providence, aided the Romans, and drove the Jews from their impregnable strongholds. Josephus, who went through the war himself from beginning to end, at first governor of Galilee and the general of the Jewish army, then as a prisoner of Vespasian, finally as a companion of Titus, and mediator between the Romans and the Jews. Remember, the Jews wouldn't listen. Recognized in this tragical event the divine judgment of God, admitted in this degenerate countryman that he had. These degenerate people, they degenerated from loving God to loving their temple and loving the Word instead of the person, to whom he had otherwise sincerely attached. I will not hesitate to say what gives me pain. I believe that had the Romans delayed the punishment of these villains, the city would have been swallowed up by the earth and overwhelmed with a flood, like Sodom, consumed with fire from heaven, for the generation which was in it was far more ungodly than the men on whom these punishments were procured. Their madness of the whole nation had brought them to ruin. Therefore, thus, must one of the best Roman emperors execute the long-threatened judgment of God. The most learned Jew of his time described it, and therefore, without willing or knowing it, bear testimony of the truth of the prophecy, the divinity of the mission of Jesus Christ, and the rejection of whom brought all of this judgment, the misfortune of the little babies that were too young to hear and believe, some that were even eaten by their mothers. The destruction of Jerusalem would be a worthy theme for the genius of the Christian Homer. It has been called the soul-stirring struggle of all ancient history. But there was no Jeremiah to sing the funeral dirge, the city of David or Solomon. The apocalypse was already written. And see, he keeps believing that the book of Revelation was fulfilled here. The heathen shall tread under the holy city 42 months. One of the master artists of that time, Kaulbach, has made the subject of one of the greatest paintings in the museum in Berlin. It represents the burning temple in the foreground, the high priest burying his sword in his own breast. Around him, the scenes of heart-rending suffering. Above, the ancient prophets beholding the fulfillment of their oracle. Beneath, Titus with the Roman army as unconscious executor of the divine wrath of God. Below to the left is Ahasuerus and the wandering Jew of the medieval legend driven by furies into the undying future. And to the right of the group of Christians departing in peace from the scene of destruction, and Jewish children imploring their protection. What a story. What a story. It happened. That's not some figment of somebody's imagination. It happened. It says the total number killed at the close of the war was 1,356,460. There were 101,700 slaves taken. There were so many Jewish slaves that they took them and they would work them, but they wouldn't feed them. They were so cheap to buy one that they would work them until they die and buy another one. They wouldn't feed them. Work them to death, like what happened in Germany, Auschwitz, etc. Josephus, they said, was richly rewarded for his treachery. Titus the Domitian continued the favors, but his countrymen embittered his life and cursed his memory. Josephus became a traitor to his people, they said. Josephus wrote the truth. When he wrote about Jesus, he said he was an unusual man, a great prophet, a great healer of many, and even divine. If you want to call him a man, it might be injustice, because I believe he was divine. This is what happened. I taught church history, but I'm going back into the details and letting you see here and letting you see there what really happened with real historical writings of what really happened. The Christians watched this happen. They watched it. They weren't part of it. They didn't want the Jews to be killed. They wanted them to be saved. Paul wanted them to be saved. He said, let me be accursed if my nation, if my people could be saved. Let me go to hell if my nation could be saved. Today we have a people out here that are unbelievers, and a lot of unbelievers in this country. They want to gnash their teeth at God. They may not go through what's here, what happened here, but someday in that great white throne judgment, they'll be cast forever in the lake of fire. That's file 13 of all unbelievers. God does not love them. Those people will be separated from God forever. They didn't want to have anything to do with God, so they will never have anything to do with God. God's not going to make them unhappy. They're going to be right where they want to be. They denied hell. They denied unbelievers. They denied Him. And yet that's where they're going. Our Father, we send this message out for Your honor and glory. Please use it wherever it goes. Please let people that are not saved see what's going to happen, see what will happen. I pray that some wandering Jew someplace will hear the message and be saved. Father, please forgive me where I failed You. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.